The stars flickered faintly above the scorched landscape, their distant brilliance almost lost in the thick veil of smoke that choked the battlefield. Derek could barely see them now, their once reassuring presence swallowed by the storm of war. Plasma bolts streaked through the air, crisscrossing like deadly comets, lighting up the ruins of what was once a thriving planet on the fringes of the Galactic Empire. The ground trembled beneath his boots as explosions rippled across the horizon, each one tearing deeper into the land and into the lives of those who fought for it. Derek had seen enough of these wars' planets consumed by the fires of rebellion, empires crumbling under their own weight. It was the same, always the same. This time the planet was called Drax 7, but names didn't matter anymore. It was just another battleground. "Keep your heads down," Derek barked, his voice roughened by years of shouting over the din of war. His squad, a ragtag team of survivors from a dozen other battlefields, obeyed without question. They knew better than to argue with Derek. He had earned his reputation as a man who didn't just survive wars, he conquered them. With a practiced motion, Derek raised his rifle and took aim. His visor scanned the battlefield ahead, feeding him data in the form of flashing holographic readouts. The rebels were coming, a wave of fanatical insurgents determined to take back the planet from the Empire's grasp. They charged across the battlefield with reckless abandon, their makeshift armor glowing with the energy of stolen tech. Derek's fingers tightened around the trigger, and in one fluid motion he unleashed a volley of fire. The plasma bolts tore through the air, striking down 3 enemies before they even had a chance to fire back. He didn't feel the thrill of victory, didn't bask in the satisfaction of another kill. This was just survival. Cold. Efficient. "Derek, we've got movement on the south ridge," crackled a voice over his comms. It was Rook, his second in command, perched atop a pile of debris with a sniper rifle slung over his shoulder. Rook's voice was calm, even as chaos raged around them. "They're pushing hard. Might be trying to flank us." Derek cursed under his breath. "Hold the line," he ordered. "We can't let them break through." His mind worked quickly, processing the battlefield like a machine. The rebels were desperate. This planet was one of their last strongholds, and they were throwing everything they had into the fight. If they managed to break the Imperial forces here, the rebellion would spread like wildfire through the galaxy. But it wasn't Derek's job to care about the politics. He fought because he was good at it. He fought because it was all he knew. The earth shook again, a deafening blast sending a plume of fire and debris into the sky. Derek shielded his face as shards of metal and stone rained down around him. When the dust cleared, he saw a massive gap in their defenses, a breach in the line that would let the rebels pour through like floodwaters. "Rook, get ready for..." Before he could finish, a shadow fell over him, and Derek looked up to see the unmistakable form of an Imperial dropship descending from the clouds. Its sleek, obsidian hull gleamed against the backdrop of destruction, and its engines roared like a beast descending from the heavens. He recognized the design immediately. It wasn't just any transport. This was the personal ship of the Empress herself. "What the hell is she doing here?" Derek muttered, eyes narrowing. The Empress had no business on the front lines. Imperial rulers didn't risk themselves in the heat of battle. They ruled from afar, behind walls of safety, protected by legions of soldiers like Derek. He'd never once imagined the Galactic Empress would set foot on a war-ravaged planet like Drax 7. The dropship touched down a few hundred yards away, and immediately, elite Imperial guards began to disembark, forming a protective perimeter. Through the haze of smoke, Derek caught a glimpse of her, a slender, regal figure cloaked in dark armor that shimmered with a strange, otherworldly energy. Even at this distance, he could feel her presence, an aura of authority and power that pressed down on him like an invisible force. That had to be her, Xylara, the Galactic Empress. "Empress is on the ground," Rook's voice crackled through the comms again, this time tinged with disbelief. "What the hell's going on, Derek?" "I don't know," Derek replied, his mind racing. This wasn't just a battle anymore. If the Empress was here, it meant something far more significant was happening. "Keep your eyes open. This could be a trap." Even as he spoke, the rebels seemed to sense the shift in the battlefield. Their attacks grew more frantic, more desperate, as if they knew this was their last chance to strike at the heart of the Empire. A massive explosion rocked the ground, and Derek's visor flashed red with a warning: enemy artillery inbound. "Move," he shouted, grabbing one of his men by the shoulder and pushing him to the ground as a shell detonated nearby. The blast sent a shockwave through the air, knocking Derek off his feet. He hit the ground hard, his armor absorbing most of the impact, but his head rang from the concussive force. When he scrambled back to his feet, his heart sank. The Imperial guards around the Empress were faltering under the weight of the rebel onslaught. Explosions tore through their ranks, sending bodies flying. The dropship was engulfed in flames, and in the chaos, Derek saw something that chilled him to the core. The rebels had broken through. A squad of them had slipped past the Imperial lines, and they were heading straight for the Empress. "Damn it," Derek growled, throwing himself into motion. His instincts took over, pushing aside any hesitation. It wasn't his job to protect her, he wasn't a part of her elite guard, and he owed no allegiance to the throne, but he couldn't let her fall. Not here. Not like this. Derek sprinted across the battlefield, his muscles burning as he dodged plasma fire and leaped over craters. His mind was focused, the chaos around him fading into the background. The rebels were closing in on the Empress, their weapons raised, ready to strike. Time seemed to slow as Derek closed the distance. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he wasn't sure why he was doing this. He didn't care about the Empire. He didn't care about the Empress. But something deep within him drove him forward. He reached the Empress just as the first rebel lunged at her. With a single, precise shot, Derek put the attacker down, the plasma bolt piercing through the rebel's chest. The rest of the squad turned toward him, but they were too slow. Derek moved like a whirlwind, his rifle and combat knife flashing in unison as he cut down the rebels with brutal efficiency. Blood and ash filled the air, but Derek didn't stop until the last of them lay dead at his feet. Only then did he turn to the Empress. Up close, she was even more striking than he had imagined. Her dark hair framed a face of cold, perfect beauty, her eyes glowing faintly with a light that seemed to come from within. She stared at him, unblinking, her expression unreadable. "Who are you?" Xylara's voice was soft but commanding, like a whisper laced with steel. "Derek," he replied, his breath heavy from the fight. "Just a soldier." "A soldier," she repeated, her gaze lingering on him. There was something strange in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. Curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper. "You saved my life." "Don't mention it," Derek said gruffly, turning away. "You should get back to your ship. This place isn't safe." But even as he spoke, he could feel the weight of her gaze on him, as if she was seeing something in him that no one else had ever seen. It made him uneasy. "I have no intention of retreating," she said, her voice firm. "This is my empire, and I will not abandon it." Derek didn't respond. He had no love for the Empire, no loyalty to its rulers, but standing there, in the midst of the battlefield, with the Galactic Empress staring at him as if he was the key to something far greater, he felt a strange pull, a connection that he didn't fully understand. And then the ground shook again. A new wave of rebel forces was approaching, and this time they were bringing heavier firepower. Derek's calm crackled to life, Rook's panicked voice cutting through the static. "Derek, we've got incoming. We need to fall back now." Derek clenched his jaw. He looked at Xylara, her face set with determination, and then at the approaching enemy forces. He knew they were outnumbered, outgunned. This battle was spiraling out of control. But something told him that this wasn't just another battle. This was the moment everything would change. And as the rebels drew closer, Derek made his decision. "Stay close to me," he said, stepping forward to shield the Empress. "We're getting out of here. Together." Xylara's eyes flashed with something. Was it surprise? Gratitude? He couldn't be sure. But as they moved into the storm of war, side by side, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just become entangled with hers, in a way he hadn't anticipated. And in the heart of the battlefield, under the fading light of distant stars, the fates of a soldier and an empress began to intertwine. The silence of space was a welcome reprieve from the chaos of the battlefield. The hum of the Imperial flagship's engines resonated through the walls like a distant heartbeat, steady and constant. Derek stood in front of the viewport in his temporary quarters, his eyes tracing the endless expanse of stars outside. The violent energy of battle had faded, replaced by an unnerving quiet. But it wasn't peace he felt. It was a different kind of tension, one he couldn't shake since the moment he had saved Xylara on the battlefield. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring down at the polished floor beneath him. Despite the lavish surroundings, his quarters were outfitted with opulence that would have made any soldier envious. He couldn't feel at ease here. This wasn't his world. He wasn't a man built for luxury, for the glittering halls of power. His place had always been out there, in the dirt and blood of war. The door to his quarters hissed open, and Rook stepped inside, his face set in an uneasy frown. "They treating you well enough?" Rook asked, glancing around the room with a raised brow. His tone was casual, but Derek could sense the tension in his voice. Rook wasn't any more comfortable in this place than he was. Derek grunted in response. "Too well, if you ask me." Rook chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Figures. We fight their wars, bleed for their empire, and they think we'll be grateful for a few fancy rooms. What's the play here, Derek? Why are we still on this damn ship?" Derek didn't answer right away. He hadn't yet figured that out himself. After the battle on Drax 7, Sylara had personally requested that he and his team accompany her back to the Imperial capital. She'd insisted on it, as if Derek's refusal wasn't an option. Not that he had much say in the matter. When the Galactic Empress demanded something, you didn't exactly have the luxury of declining. And now here they were, in orbit above the Empire's capital world, waiting. But waiting for what? "I don't know," Derek admitted, his voice low, "but something tells me we're not just here for a victory parade." Rook folded his arms, leaning against the wall with a skeptical expression. "You think she's got some kind of plan for us?" "More like a plan for me," Derek said, the weight of those words hanging in the air. Since the moment he had locked eyes with Sylara on the battlefield, he'd sensed something, a pull, a connection he couldn't explain. And now that same pull was drawing him deeper into the orbit of her empire, whether he wanted it or not. "I don't trust it," Rook muttered. "She's dangerous, Derek. I've heard the stories. Empress Azara doesn't just rule this galaxy, she owns it. And you don't get that kind of power by playing nice." Derek didn't argue. He'd seen enough of the galaxy to know how power worked. He knew what rulers like Sylara were capable of. But there was something about her that unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. He couldn't shake the memory of their brief exchange on the battlefield, the way her eyes had lingered on him, as if she saw something in him that no one else did. Something that made him dangerous to her, too. Before Derek could respond, the comm panel on the wall crackled to life. The voice on the other end was crisp, formal. "Lieutenant Derek, the Empress requests your presence in her private chambers. Immediately." Rook shot Derek a wary glance. "You sure about this?" "No," Derek said, standing up from his seat. "But it looks like I don't have much of a choice." The corridors of the Imperial flagship were vast and gleaming, a testament to the technological superiority of Zylara's empire. Derek's boots echoed against the polished floors as he made his way toward the Empress's private chambers, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't fully grasp. The closer he got to her, the heavier the air seemed to grow. The guards stationed along the way barely glanced at him after all. He was the man who had saved their Empress's life, but Derek could feel their eyes on him, as if they were weighing his every move, silently assessing whether he was worthy of standing in the presence of their ruler. At last he reached the grand doors that led to her chambers. They were adorned with intricate designs, symbols of power and dominance etched into the metal like ancient runes. With a deep breath, Derek stepped forward as the doors slid open with a soft hiss. The room beyond was vast, but it wasn't the size that struck Derek, it was the view. The entire rear wall was a massive window, revealing the endless sea of stars outside. And there, standing before it, silhouetted against the backdrop of the galaxy, was Ilara. She didn't turn to face him immediately. Instead, she stood with her back to him, her figure draped in a flowing black garment that shimmered faintly in the low light. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and Derek felt the weight of it pressing down on him like an invisible force. "You saved my life," Sylara said, her voice cutting through the silence. It was not a question, but a statement, cold, precise. Yet there was an undercurrent of something else, something softer, almost imperceptible. "I did what any soldier would do," Derek replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Any soldier," Sylara turned then, her sharp eyes locking onto his. The pale glow in her irises seemed to burn brighter as she stepped closer to him. "No, Derek, not any soldier. Most would have hesitated, most would have thought of their own survival first." Derek said nothing. There was no point in trying to explain himself to her. He had acted on instinct, and now he was standing in the presence of the most powerful woman in the galaxy because of it. Zalara moved gracefully, her footsteps barely audible as she crossed the room to stand directly in front of him. She studied him, her gaze intense, as if she was peeling back the layers of his soul to see what lay beneath the surface. "You're different," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper now. "I can see it in your eyes. You're not like the others." Derek tensed. "I'm just a soldier." "No," she said again, this time with certainty. "You're more than that. I felt it the moment you saved me. There's something inside you, Derek, something that sets you apart from the rest of them." He didn't know how to respond. The way she spoke, the way her words curled around him like a tendril of smoke, made him feel both uneasy and intrigued. "What do you want from me?" Empress Derek asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Silara's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I want you by my side." Derek blinked, taken aback. "Your side?" "As my protector," she clarified, but there was a flicker in her eyes that suggested it was more than that. "You've proven yourself capable. I need someone I can trust, someone who isn't afraid to challenge me, to stand beside me in the face of rebellion." Derek's chest tightened. He had expected some kind of reward for saving her life, perhaps a medal or a temporary promotion. But this was something entirely different. "I don't serve the Empire," Derek said, his tone hardening. "I fight because that's what I know. But I don't pledge myself to anyone." Silara's expression didn't falter, but her eyes darkened, the faint glow within them dimming. "I'm not asking for your loyalty to the Empire. I'm asking for you to stand with me." Derek's heart raced. The pull he'd felt before the strange connection between them grew stronger now, a magnetic force that drew him closer to her, despite the voice in his head screaming at him to stay away. "You want me to be your bodyguard?" Derek asked, though he knew the answer was far more complicated. Silara's lips parted, and for the briefest moment Derek thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability pass over her face. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, impenetrable mask of a ruler. "I want you to be more than that," she said, her voice lowering to a whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. "I want you to be my equal, my partner." Derek's mind reeled. This was madness. He was a soldier, an independent one at that. He didn't belong in her world of politics and power. And yet, there was a part of him, a small, dangerous part, that was tempted. The thought of standing beside her, of being at the heart of the galaxy's most powerful empire. But no, he couldn't allow himself to be drawn in by her. He had fought too long and too hard to remain free, to resist the pull of power that had corrupted so many others. "I'm not interested," Derek said firmly, taking a step back. "I'm a soldier, nothing more." Silara's eyes flashed with something he couldn't quite identify. Was it disappointment? Anger? He couldn't tell. "You can't run from this," she said, her voice suddenly sharper, more commanding. "I've seen what you're capable of, Derek. You think you can just walk away from that? From me?" Derek clenched his fists, feeling the tension rise between them. "I didn't ask for any of this." "No," she agreed, her gaze softening slightly. "But fate brought us together, and fate has a way of binding people, whether they want it or not." Derek turned away, staring out at the stars once more. He didn't believe in fate. He believed in choices, in actions. But standing here, in the presence of the Empress, he couldn't help but feel the weight of something larger than himself pressing down on him. "I need time," he said finally, his voice quiet. Zalara nodded, though her expression remained unreadable. "Take the time you need, Derek. But remember this, the galaxy is changing. War is coming whether you stand with me or not." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Derek alone with his thoughts and the infinite expanse of space stretching out before him. He had a choice to make, and deep down he knew that whatever decision he made, his life would never be the same. The air in the imperial capital was thick with the electric hum of activity, a pulse of life that never truly quieted, even in the dead of night. From the window of his quarters, Derek gazed out at the sprawling expanse of the city below, its shimmering towers piercing the sky like the fingers of some ancient god. The city was a marvel of technological brilliance, the heart of the empire, and yet Derek felt an unease stirring in his chest every time he looked at it. He didn't belong here. The view did nothing to soothe the growing tension in his body, the restlessness that had settled in since his encounter with Xylara. Her words echoed in his mind, a constant refrain of power, destiny, and fate that he couldn't shake. I want you by my side. I want you to be my equal, my partner. It had been a week since that meeting in her private chambers, and Derek had done his best to avoid the Empress ever since. He'd spent his days in training simulations, pushing his body to exhaustion, trying to focus on anything other than the looming decision before him. But no matter how hard he fought to escape it, the weight of her request clung to him like a chain tightening around his neck. He wasn't a ruler. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a soldier, nothing more. He had fought and bled on 100 different worlds, and yet the prospect of aligning himself with Xylara and her empire terrified him in ways no battlefield ever had. He knew why. Trust. That was what it came down to. Derek had never given it lightly, and he had learned the hard way that in war, trust was a commodity more fragile than the thinnest thread. And yet here he was, being asked to give that fragile thing to the most powerful woman in the galaxy, a ruler who had built her empire on dominance and control. A soft knock on his door broke through his thoughts, drawing him back to the present. "Come in," Derek called, his voice rougher than he intended. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and Rook stepped inside, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," Rook said without preamble, his tone low and urgent. Derek's muscles tensed instantly. Rook wasn't the kind of man to speak in dramatic terms unless it was warranted, and the look on his face told Derek that whatever was happening wasn't something they could afford to ignore. "What is it?" Derek asked, crossing the room to meet his second in command. Rook glanced over his shoulder, as if to make sure they were alone, before speaking again. "I've been hearing whispers, rumors, mostly, but they're getting louder." Rumors about what Derek pressed, though he had a sinking feeling that he already knew the answer. "The rebellion," Rook said. "It's growing, Derek, and it's not just out on the fringe worlds anymore. There's talk of traitors inside the Imperial Court, people close to the Empress plotting against her." Derek frowned, his mind racing. "You think it's true?" "I don't know," Rook admitted, his voice tight with frustration. "But I've been talking to some of the lower-ranking officers, the ones who hear things that don't make it up the chain. They're all saying the same thing: the Empire isn't as stable as it looks. And if there's even a shred of truth to these rumors, it means Xylara is in serious danger." Derek felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had known that the rebellion was gaining momentum. The battle on Drax 7 had been proof of that, but the idea that the rot had spread to the core of the Empire itself, that was a different kind of threat. A more insidious one. "Does the Empress know?" Derek asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Rook shook his head. "If she does, she's not showing it. From what I can tell, she's still focused on the outer rebellions, trying to quash them before they gain any more ground. But if she's got enemies this close, one's hiding in plain sight." Derek nodded, understanding the implications. If Xylara was surrounded by traitors in her own court, it meant that the rebellion had already breached the walls of her empire. And if that were the case, it was only a matter of time before the entire structure came crashing down. "What do we do?" Rook asked, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty. It was rare for Rook to look to Derek for direction like this. Normally they worked as equals, with Rook handling the tactical side of things while Derek dealt with the more hands-on aspects of leadership. But this wasn't a battlefield they were used to navigating. Derek took a deep breath, his mind working quickly. They couldn't afford to wait for the rebellion to show its hand. If there were traitors in the Imperial Court, they had to root them out before they could strike. And that meant taking risks. "I need to see the Empress," Derek said, the decision solidifying in his mind. "We need to warn her about this, but we have to do it carefully. If there are traitors, we can't let them know we're onto them." Rook's expression darkened, but he nodded in agreement. "You sure you can trust her?" Derek hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded. "I don't know if I trust her completely, but right now she's our best shot at stopping this from turning into a full-scale coup. If she's got enemies in her own court, she needs to know." Rook sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, I'll keep digging on my end, see if I can find any more solid intel. But you be careful, Derek. These people, they're playing a different kind of game. We're not used to fighting in the shadows." Derek gave him a grim smile. "Don't worry, Rook. I know how to handle myself." As Rook turned to leave, Derek felt the tension in the room thicken. The stakes had just been raised, and the next move was his. Derek stood outside the entrance to Xylara's private chambers, the faint hum of the ship's systems the only sound accompanying the rhythmic thud of his heart. His mind raced through the possibilities, the dangers. If there were traitors this close to the Empress, then every step he took was a gamble. Every word he spoke could be overheard, twisted, or used against him. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he activated the comm panel beside the door. Moments later, the voice of one of Xylara's attendants answered. "The Empress is expecting you, Lieutenant Derek," came the smooth, formal tone. "You may enter." The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the familiar vast expanse of Xylara's chambers. The view of the stars, once again, framed her silhouette as she stood near the massive window. The glow from distant nebulae cast her figure in an ethereal light, but there was a stillness about her that was different from before, something more guarded. "Empress," Derek said as he stepped into the room, keeping his voice even. Xylara didn't turn immediately. Instead, she remained facing the stars, her back straight and regal, as though she were communing with the galaxy itself. When she finally did speak, her voice was calm but held a dangerous undercurrent. "You've come to give me your decision," she said softly, still not looking at him. "Or is there something else troubling you?" Derek hesitated. He had intended to ease into the conversation, to feel her out before broaching the subject of the rebellion and the potential traitors within her court. But Xylara had a way of seeing through pretense, of cutting through the layers of politeness that surrounded imperial life. "I've heard things," Derek said carefully, stepping further into the room, "about the rebellion, and about people within your own ranks who may be working against you." At that, Xylara turned, her pale eyes locking onto his. For a moment there was no emotion on her face, just a mask of calm control. But beneath that, Derek could sense the storm brewing. "Go on," she said, her voice dangerously soft. Derek met her gaze, refusing to flinch under the weight of it. "There are rumors of traitors in the imperial court, people close to you who are planning to turn against you. I don't have names yet, but if these whispers are true, you need to act. Quietly." Xylara remained silent for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his. The tension in the air was palpable, like the charged atmosphere before a lightning strike. Finally she spoke, her tone icy. "And what makes you think I am unaware of such rumors?" Derek blinked, caught off guard. He had expected surprise, maybe anger, but not this. Xylara's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes, something dark and calculating. "Do you think I've ruled this empire for so long without knowing who stands against me?" she asked, her voice cold and sharp. "The rebellion is not the only threat I face, Derek. I have enemies in every corner of this galaxy, and yes, even within my own court. This is the nature of power." Derek's jaw tightened. He had underestimated her. She wasn't just a ruler who demanded loyalty, she was a strategist, a woman who understood the treacherous game of politics better than anyone. "So you knew?" he asked, his voice low. "And you haven't acted?" Xylara's lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. "I've acted, Derek. But in matters like these, one must be careful. Traitors are like weeds, they must be rooted out carefully, or you risk pulling up the entire garden." Derek's mind raced. He had thought he was bringing her valuable information, but now he realized that she had been playing this game long before he had even entered the arena. "You brought this to me because you're concerned," Xylara said, stepping closer to him, her eyes searching his. "Because you care." Derek opened his mouth to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he felt the pull of her presence again, the strange connection between them that defied logic or reason. "I need you to trust me," Xylara said softly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I need you to stand with me, Derek, because what's coming, it's more dangerous than any battle you've fought before." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Derek's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, caught between his instincts as a soldier and the growing sense that this was more than just a fight for survival. This was a test of loyalty, of trust, and of something deeper, something neither of them could yet name. Derek took a deep breath, his decision forming in his mind. He didn't fully trust her, not yet, but he couldn't walk away, not now. "I'll stand with you," he said, his voice steady, "but we do this my way. No more secrets." Xylara's eyes gleamed, and for the first time he saw something in her expression that he hadn't seen before. Hope. The air inside the Imperial war room was heavy with tension, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the massive table where Zalara's highest-ranking officials gathered. Derek stood at the far end, his eyes fixed on the glowing holographic map of the galaxy that floated above the table, showing the growing rebellion's movements. Red indicators pulsed with intensity, marking the areas where rebel forces had pushed dangerously close to the core worlds of the Empire. A storm was brewing, one that would either see the Empire fall or Zalara claim ultimate victory. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on Derek like a leaden cloak, but his mind was elsewhere, consumed by the conversation he'd had with Zalara the night before. "I need you to trust me." Her words had replayed in his head over and over, as if they were a part of him now, embedded in his very soul. He had stood with her, despite the risks, despite the growing realization that his fate was now tied to hers in ways he couldn't explain. And yet, trust had never come easily to him. It was a fragile thing, trust something that could be shattered in an instant. He had learned that lesson the hard way, on the countless battlefields where loyalty was as scarce as mercy. Trust had gotten men killed. It had gotten him nearly killed. But here he was, standing in the heart of the Empire, ready to fight for a ruler he barely knew, a woman who had demanded everything from him, and who seemed to offer little in return, except for the constant threat of an even greater danger. The murmur of voices in the war room grew louder as Zalara entered, her regal figure commanding instant silence. Dressed in her dark, flowing Imperial armor, she moved with an elegance and precision that reminded Derek of a predator circling its prey. But there was something different about her today, something in the set of her shoulders and the glint in her eyes. Determination, resolve. And something else. A vulnerability so carefully hidden it was almost imperceptible. "Ladies and gentlemen," Zalara began, her voice cutting through the silence, "the rebellion is closer than ever to breaching our defenses. We have pushed them back on the outer worlds, but the core remains vulnerable. We cannot afford to wait for them to strike again. This war will be decided in the next few weeks, and we must act decisively." The officials around the table nodded in agreement, but Derek saw the uncertainty in their eyes. Even Zalara, for all her strength, knew the gravity of the situation. If they failed now, the Empire would crumble. The rebellion had grown too strong, its momentum too dangerous to stop with half measures. "The time for defense is over," Zalara continued. "We will strike at the heart of the rebellion and end this war once and for all. But to do that, we need more than just soldiers and ships. We need strategy. We need precision." Her gaze flickered to Derek, and for a brief moment he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten, a flicker of trust, of reliance, as if she was silently asking him to stand with her once more. Derek met her gaze, his jaw set in determination. "I'll lead the strike team," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We take out their command center, cut the head off the snake. The rest will fall apart after that." There was a murmur of surprise among the officials, but Zalara's expression remained unreadable. She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You're sure you can handle it?" she asked, her tone laced with something deeper than just curiosity. Derek nodded. "I've handled worse." For a moment there was only silence between them, a charged stillness that seemed to hum with the weight of everything left unsaid. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, Zalara turned to her advisors. "Prepare the fleet," she ordered. "We move at dawn." The battle was over before the sun had even fully risen over the Imperial capital. The rebel command center had been destroyed in a swift, surgical strike led by Derek and his team. It had been brutal and bloody, but effective. The rebels, leaderless and disorganized, had crumbled in the aftermath, their forces retreating to the far reaches of the galaxy in disarray. The war, at least for now, was over. Derek stood on the balcony of the Imperial Palace, the cool night air washing over him as he stared out at the sprawling city below. It was eerily quiet now, the distant sounds of celebration from the lower levels barely reaching his ears. He had fought in dozens of wars, seen hundreds of battles, but this one had been different. This one had left something inside him unsettled. And it wasn't just the battle. It was the Empress. He had expected to feel a sense of closure, of relief, now that the rebellion had been quashed, but instead, all he felt was a gnawing unease, a feeling that something was unfinished, something left unsaid. The sound of footsteps behind him made him tense, but he didn't need to turn to know who it was. Salara's voice was soft, almost hesitant, as she approached. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. She was dressed in her formal robes now, a stark contrast to the fierce armor she had worn in battle. But there was a weariness in her expression, a vulnerability that made her seem almost human. "It's done," Derek said, his voice low. "The rebellion is over." Salara nodded, stepping closer until she was standing beside him at the balcony's edge. She looked out at the city, her gaze distant, as if she were searching for something beyond the lights. "Yes," she said quietly, "but at what cost?" Derek frowned, turning to study her. There was a sadness in her voice that he hadn't expected. Salara, the ruthless Empress, the unyielding ruler of the galaxy, was tired. "We won," Derek said, though the words felt hollow. "The Empire is safe." "Safe," Salara repeated, a faint, bitter smile tugging at her lips. "For now." Derek didn't respond. He knew the truth as well as she did. There was always another threat, another battle waiting in the wings. Peace, in their world, was never more than an illusion. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the cool night breeze ruffling their hair. Then, Salara spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have spent my entire life fighting," she said, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Fighting to build this empire, to protect it, to keep it from falling apart. And now that the war is over, I don't know what to do." Derek looked at her, his chest tightening at the vulnerability in her words. This was a side of Salara he had never seen before, the side that wasn't an empress, but a woman who had carried the weight of the galaxy on her shoulders for far too long. "You rebuild," Derek said softly. "You make sure it's stronger than before." Salara turned to him then, her eyes shimmering in the dim light. "And what about you, Derek? What will you do now that the war is over?" He hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He had spent so long fighting, so long surviving, that he had never really considered what came next. He had never had to. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "I've never been good at anything other than war." Salara's gaze softened, and for the first time she reached out, her fingers lightly brushing his arm. The touch was gentle, hesitant, as if she were unsure of how he would respond. "I don't want you to leave," she said quietly, her voice trembling just enough for Derek to hear the emotion behind it. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked down at her, the intensity of her gaze drawing him in, making it hard to breathe. For so long, he had kept his distance, kept his emotions locked behind a wall of duty and survival. But now, standing here, so close to her, he felt that wall begin to crumble. "Why?" Derek asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Salara's hand tightened slightly on his arm, her eyes searching his, as if she were looking for the answer to a question she hadn't yet asked. "Because," she said softly, her voice breaking on the word, "I don't want to be alone anymore." Derek's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the Empress, the most powerful woman in the galaxy, to admit something so raw, so human. "I've spent my entire life ruling," Salara continued, her eyes never leaving his. "I've been feared, respected, obeyed, but I've never had anyone who truly stood with me, not until you." Derek's pulse quickened, his mind racing. He had always thought of Salara as distant, untouchable, a force of nature beyond his comprehension. But now, standing here, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, he realized how wrong he had been. She was not untouchable. She was not invincible. She was human, just like him. "You don't have to be alone," Derek said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not anymore." Salara's eyes widened slightly at his words, and for the first time Derek saw something in her expression that he hadn't expected: hope. "Derek," she whispered, stepping closer to him, her hand sliding up to rest on his chest. "I don't want you as my soldier. I don't want you as my protector." Derek's heart pounded in his chest as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and fear. "I want you as my partner," she whispered, her voice trembling. "As my lover." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid between them. Derek's breath hitched in his throat, his mind reeling. He had never expected this, had never even considered the possibility that the Empress, the woman who ruled the galaxy, could want something so personal from him. But as he looked into her eyes, as he felt the warmth of her hand against his chest. He knew that he couldn't deny what had been building between them since the moment they had met. He felt it too. Slowly, hesitantly, Derek reached up and took her hand in his fingers brushing against her skin as if testing the weight of this moment. Salara's breath caught, and for the first time Derek saw the full extent of her vulnerability. This wasn't a demand. This wasn't an order. This was a request, a plea for something more than power, more than control. It was a plea for connection. Derek's voice faltered as he struggled to find the words. I never thought. Salara's hand tightened in his, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. Neither did I. For a long moment they stood there, the weight of their unspoken feelings hanging between them. And then, slowly, as if drawn together by some invisible force, Derek leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a tentative, delicate kiss. It was soft, at first hesitant, unsure, but as Salara responded, as she melted into him, the kiss deepened, the intensity of their emotions spilling over in a rush of passion that neither of them could contain. In that moment, Derek knew that everything had changed. The war was over. The rebellion was crushed. But something far more important had been born in its place, something deeper, more profound. And for the first time in a long, long time, Derek felt a sense of peace. Not because the battles were over, but because he had finally found something worth fighting for. The imperial capital was bathed in a soft, golden light as the twin suns began to set beyond the horizon. From the grand balcony of the palace, Derek stood beside Salara, his gaze sweeping across the vast city below. It had been weeks since the rebellion's defeat, weeks since he had made the decision to stay by her side not as a soldier, but as something much more. The empire had slowly begun the process of healing, its citizens breathing easier now that the threat of civil war had passed. Yet within the palace, behind the towering walls and the shimmering corridors of marble and steel, a quieter, more intimate transformation was taking place. Derek shifted his gaze to Salara, who stood at the balcony's edge, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, illuminated by the fading sunlight. She looked peaceful, yet thoughtful, as if 1,000 thoughts were swirling just beneath her calm exterior. He had come to understand that this was her way, always contemplative, always carrying the weight of her empire on her shoulders, even in the moments when it seemed she had found peace. But there was a new softness in her eyes now when she looked at him, a kind of vulnerability that had not been there before. It was a vulnerability they had both shared in their private moments, when the palace halls were quiet and the only sound was the distant hum of the city. Derek took a step closer to her, feeling the warmth of her presence as he reached out and gently took her hand. She looked up at him, her pale eyes locking onto his with an intensity that never failed to take his breath away. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Salara's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was a lingering hint of uncertainty in her gaze. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "About us. About the future." Derek's heart skipped a beat at her words. It was still strange to think of their future beyond the endless cycle of battles and survival. He had never allowed himself to imagine a life where there was peace, where he didn't have to constantly look over his shoulder for the next threat. But with Salara, everything felt different now. "What about the future?" Derek asked, his voice steady, though inside his heart was racing. Salara turned to face him fully, her hand still resting in his. She looked at him with an intensity that made the world around them seem to fade away, until it was just the two of them standing in the fading light of the day. "We've spent so long fighting," she said, her voice tinged with a quiet sadness. "We've both sacrificed so much, but now that the war is over, I don't want to keep looking back. I want to look forward. And I want you with me." Derek's chest tightened at her words. He had never thought he could feel so strongly for someone, especially someone as powerful, as untouchable as Salara had once seemed. But now, here she was, standing before him, offering him something more than he had ever imagined: a life, a future, a partnership. "I'm not going anywhere," Derek said, his voice firm. "I made that decision the moment I stayed." Salara smiled at him, but there was still something lingering in her expression, something unresolved. She hesitated for a moment, as if she were gathering her thoughts, then finally spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "Derek," she began, "there is something else I need to ask you. Something personal." Derek's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded, encouraging her to continue. She took a breath before speaking, her eyes never leaving his. I've lived my entire life as a ruler trained to lead, to command, to conquer. But there are things about your world, your people, that I don't fully understand. Things I've never experienced. Derek remained silent, waiting for her to continue. He could feel the tension in her words, the uncertainty that came with vulnerability, and he wanted to give her the space to say what was on her mind. Silara's cheeks flushed slightly, something that surprised Derek, given how composed she always was. I've always been curious about human reproduction. Her words hung in the air, and Derek blinked, caught off guard by the sudden turn in the conversation. He hadn't expected her to broach such a topic, but he could see that she was being serious, genuinely curious. And beneath that curiosity was something deeper, a longing for connection that went beyond the physical. I see, Derek said slowly, his mind racing to catch up. He searched her eyes, looking for any sign that this was some kind of test or trap, but all he saw was genuine interest, and perhaps a hint of nervousness. I've studied the biology, of course, as Solara continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke, but reading about it is different from experiencing it. Derek took a slow breath, his heart pounding in his chest, as he realized where this conversation was leading. You're asking me to show you. Solara nodded, her eyes never wavering. Yes, but it's more than that, Derek. I want to understand not just the biology but the connection. The bond between two people that your kind seems to treasure so deeply. Derek's throat tightened. This was more than a physical request, this was about trust, about sharing something deeply intimate with someone who had spent her entire life behind the walls of power and duty. He took a step closer to her, his hand still holding hers. Solara, he said softly, what you're asking. It's not just about biology, it's about emotion, connection, it's about trust. She looked up at him, her eyes softening as she nodded. I know, that's why I'm asking you. Derek felt his heart swell in his chest, a mixture of emotions swirling inside him, desire, yes, but also something much deeper. He had spent his life keeping people at a distance, never allowing anyone to get too close. But now here was Solara, asking him to share something with her that went beyond the battlefield, beyond duty. It was a kind of trust he had never known before. Are you sure? Derek asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. This isn't something you can take back. Solara stepped closer to him, her hand reaching up to gently touch his cheek. I'm sure, she said softly. I trust you. The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the chest, and for a moment Derek couldn't breathe. He looked into her eyes and saw the vulnerability there, the trust she was offering him, the openness that came from letting down her walls. Slowly, carefully, Derek lifted his hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing lightly against her cheek. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a gentle, tender kiss. It was different from their first kiss. This one wasn't filled with the desperate passion of a battlefield, but with something softer, more intimate. Solara responded immediately, her hands sliding up to rest against his chest as she leaned into him, deepening the kiss. For a moment they were lost in each other, the world around them fading away as the connection between them grew stronger. But this wasn't just about desire, it was about trust, about sharing something that went beyond words. When they finally pulled apart, Derek rested his forehead against hers, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Solara's hands were still on his chest, her fingers lightly tracing the contours of his body, and he could feel her heart beating in time with his. I'll show you, Derek whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But we take it slow, together. Solara nodded, her eyes shimmering with something deep and unspoken. Together, she agreed. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet intimacy that neither of them had ever experienced before. As they spent more time together, both in the palace and in the privacy of their chambers, Derek and Solara began to explore the depths of their connection, both physically and emotionally. It wasn't just about the physical act, though, that was part of it too. It was about learning each other, about discovering the small, subtle ways in which their bodies and minds responded to one another. Derek showed Solara the intricacies of human touch, the way a simple caress could ignite a fire inside, or how a tender kiss could communicate more than words ever could. Solara, for her part, was a fast learner. She approached their time together with the same determination and focus that she brought to every aspect of her rule, but there was something more here, something softer, more vulnerable. She allowed herself to be open with him, to let down the walls she had spent a lifetime building. And Derek found himself doing the same. In those quiet moments when it was just the two of them, they shared more than just their bodies, they shared their hopes, their fears, their dreams. Solara confided in Derek about the burdens of leadership, about the loneliness that came with being the Empress. And Derek, in turn, told her about his past, about the battles that had scarred him both physically and emotionally. They grew closer with each passing day, their connection deepening in ways neither of them had expected. But there was one more step they had yet to take. The grand hall of the Imperial Palace was a sight to behold, its towering columns and shimmering walls adorned with banners of deep crimson and gold. The air was thick with anticipation, the soft murmur of voices filling the space as the guests gathered for the most important event of the year. Derek stood at the front of the hall, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited. He had faced countless battles, stood against insurmountable odds, but this moment felt different. It wasn't fear that filled him, but something much stronger. Love. The grand doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and the crowd fell silent as Xylara appeared, her figure draped in a gown of deep black and gold, her head held high with the grace and poise of an empress. But as her eyes met Derek's, there was something more in her gaze, something soft, something vulnerable. Something that was just for him. She walked slowly down the aisle, her steps measured and deliberate, but there was no hesitation in her movements. As she reached him, she took his hand, her fingers curling around his in a gesture of trust and intimacy. The officiant, a high-ranking member of the imperial court, stepped forward and began to speak, but Derek barely heard the words. His entire focus was on Solara, on the way her hand felt in his, the way her eyes never left his as they stood before the gathered crowd. Do you, Derek of the Terran people, take Empress Solara to be your partner, your equal, in both love and in rule? The officiant asked. Derek's throat tightened as he looked into Xylara's eyes. I do. And do you, Empress Solara of the Galactic Empire, take Derek to be your partner, your equal, in both love and in rule? Xylara's voice was steady as she spoke, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. I do. The officiant smiled, raising their hands in a gesture of blessing. Then by the power vested in me by the Galactic Empire, I pronounce you united in both heart and in rule. Together you shall guide this empire into its next era. The hall erupted in applause, but Derek barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the woman standing before him, the woman who had trusted him with her heart, her empire, and her future. As the cheers of the crowd washed over them, Solara leaned in, her lips brushing softly against Derek's ear. I love you, she whispered, the words so soft they were barely audible. Derek's heart swelled in his chest, and he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, as he whispered the words he had never thought he would say. I love you too. And in that moment, under the glow of 1,000 stars, Derek and Xylara stood together not as soldier and empress, but as partners, equals, lovers. Together, they would face whatever the future held.